We said we need to hear what the Rambam has to say about Purim and specifically about the Megillah, because that's supposed to throw light on what happens with the Megillah that is unique and different to the rest of the Torah. We said that Amalek has to be recorded in the Torah, Amalek has to be recorded in the books of the prophets, and Amalek has to be recorded in the section called the Kesuvim, which is the Megillah. And yet there's supposed to be something different about the Megillah. So what does the Rambam tell us about the Megillah? He says, and you've got to be very careful how you translate this, because I can easily see how people would translate this wrong. He says, when Moshiach comes, all of the books of the prophets will be batel. What does batel mean? So we've got to be careful how you translate it. But essentially, the books of the prophets will no longer have the same role in the Torah that they have currently, once Moshiach comes. Now, exactly what that means, but we're not going to throw them out. We're not going to say that because one of the fundamental principles of Judaism is that the Torah is eternal, and nothing in the Torah can ever be disqualified. But the implication is that the books of the prophets will not have the same impact and will not have the same force within Judaism as they currently have once Moshiach comes.
You'll have to put a D at the end of bottle.
Yeah. And the same applies to the books of the Kesuvim, which is also interesting, right? With one exception. The only book out of all of the books of the prophets and all of the books of the Kesuvim that will not lose its status when Moshiach comes is the book of Esther, Megillas Esther. Now you've got to ask yourself, why? What makes it so special? What makes it so unique that it's going to outlast, that it's going to retain its status? Now, generally speaking, it's a little bit of an aside. Generally speaking, when we say that once Moshiach comes, something will lose its impact or lose its status, generally what that means is that because at the time of Moshiach there'll be such an intense exposure of godliness that compared to that exposure of godliness, the level of godliness that was previously accessible through these things will no longer be so relevant. That's usually what it means. But we're looking from a more technical perspective here, which is, why is the Megillah so unique? And the answer that is suggested is because of the verse that we learned about yesterday, which is that when they have the war against Amalek, Hashem tells Moshe, K'soiv zois, write this down, Zikaron, as a remembrance, Sefer, in a book. So K'soiv zois, write this down, that refers to where you write it in the Torah. Zikaron, as a memory, that refers to where you write it in the prophets, in the book of Shmuel. Sefer, in a book, that refers to the Megillah. So because the Torah says that it has to be a book, that implies that for the rest of history, it will be a book. Meaning to say it will still have the status and the value of a book of the Torah with all of the force of being a book of the Torah. That's what it would seem to be saying. Okay? That's what it would seem to be saying. But we need to unpack this a little bit further and understand a little bit better. Again, what is so unique about the book of Esther that it has this status, that it has this endurance, that it has this capacity to, so to speak, play in the big league? What is it? So let's go back and revisit the story of what happened between Esther and the sages. Esther goes to the sages after the Purim story. She says, wow, we have just witnessed the most incredible miracle. And when Hashem does something like this, you have to commemorate it and you have to record it. And of course, you have to celebrate it. And they're all for celebrating it. We're going to establish a day and it's going to be called Purim. But Esther says that's not good enough. She wants the book to be considered now part of the Tanakh. She wants her story to be recorded for posterity. And they say to her, what do they say? They say, we have a tradition that the story of Amalek can only be recorded 3 times in the Torah. And as far as we can see, it is already recorded 3 times. It's recorded in the parasha of Beshalach, which is in the Torah. It's recorded in the parasha of Kiseitze, which is in the Torah. And it's recorded in the book of Shmuel, which is in the prophets. And that's it. We've now used up our 3 slots. And there's no further slots for any additional references to Amalek. And then they do a little bit of a review. And they come back to the verse where Hashem says to Moshe, K'soiv zois, write this down, Zikaron, as a memory, Sefer, in a book. And they say, oh, now on analysis, We actually do have a space. Why do we have a space? Because the two references in the Torah, although they're in two different parashas, B'Shalach and Kisei, they actually count as one seat. So that's one Amalek seat is filled. A second Amalek seat is filled in the prophets. And there's still one available. Great, we can make your Megillah. What changed in their thinking? What's the switch? Did they not know this verse before? Had they never learned this? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. What changed in their thinking? Generally, what distinguishes the three segments of the Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, and Kesuvim, generally what distinguishes them is what level of divine inspiration created or influenced the writing of each book. In other words, the 5 books of Moses, right, the Chumash, 5 books of the Chumash, what level of divine inspiration did Moshe have? Because Moshe ultimately is the person who was responsible for recording the 5 books of the Torah, right? So what level of inspiration, what level of Ruach HaKodesh, of divine interaction or prophecy, whatever word you want to use, what level did he have? The highest. At the highest. In fact, he had such a unique level of prophecy that the Rambam tells us there are 13 principles of Jewish faith. One of the principles of Jewish faith is to believe that there's prophecy. And another principle of Jewish faith is to believe that there's a prophecy like Moshe had. That immediately qualifies them as 2 completely different kinds of prophecy. And the Rambam gets that. In fact, that's what the Rambam writes in terms of the Yesodos, the foundations of faith. When he goes through the laws of in his introduction, like the first section of laws of fundamental principles of Judaism, so he separates between regular prophecy and the prophecy of Moshiach, of Moshe, and he goes into a lot of detail about it. Where does the Rambam get that from? So there's a story. It's a very uncomfortable story. But there's a story where Miriam, who is Moshe's sister, overhears Moshe's wife making a comment about how difficult it is to be married to such a prophet. And essentially what she's saying is that ever since he became such a prophet, he's never at home. He doesn't have a relationship with me, he only has a relationship with Hashem. So Miriam is concerned about this, and she thinks that potentially there's some problem of shalom bayis in the house. So she calls her brother Aaron, and they have a family meeting, and they plan an intervention. The only thing is, before they could have their intervention, Hashem plans another intervention. And Hashem summons Aaron and Miriam for an urgent meeting in his office. And eventually what happens is Miriam ends up having tzaras, and she's got to be separated from the camp for a week, and everybody's got to wait for her. But in the interaction between Hashem and Miriam and Aaron, Hashem says, "How dare you speak against Moshe, my servant?" And then he goes into a whole explanation of what prophecy is and what Moshe's prophecy is. That every other prophet, their experience of prophecy is either a vision or a dream. And the Rambam adds more to that, that when a regular prophet has a prophecy, sometimes he sees a vision, and he's also given an interpretation of the vision. Sometimes he's only given the vision, and then he has to try to work out what the interpretation is. And sometimes he's just given a message without a vision, and he has to try and find a way to convey that message to the people. But the point is that in order for an ordinary prophet to experience prophecy, they have to have an otherworldly or out-of-body experience. Not only that, the Rambam tells us that usually when a prophet has a prophecy, either he's asleep, that's why it's a dream, or if he's awake, he'll go through some kind of an experience that from the outsider's perspective will look like he's having a seizure or that he's fainted. He won't be an ordinary person because the prophecy is a very overwhelming experience, and it kind of overrides the system. It short circuits the human body. Moshe, on the other hand, Hashem says to Miriam and to Aaron, he is not like any other prophet, and he speaks to me face to face. And when he speaks to me, it's no dream and it's no vision, it's with absolute clarity. And he knows exactly what's going on. So that tells you that the Torah, which is written with Moshe's level of prophecy, is a very unique book. And it's a very high level of prophecy. Thing is that not all 5 books of the Chumash were created equally. Out of the 5 books, one of them is different to the others. Which one is that? Which one is different? Is the last one. The last one. How's the last one different? The first 4 books of the Chumash are Moshe speaking in Hashem's voice. That's why if you read the first 4 books of the Chumash, it effectively sounds like a narrator telling you a story. Avraham went here, the Jews went down to Egypt, Moshe climbed the mountain to see Hashem. There's no first person reporting. The last book of the Torah, on the other hand, that's Moshe. That's Moshe repeating everything in the big sermon that he makes before he passes away. And let me tell you, if you think you've ever heard a long sermon, this was a long sermon. And he repeats everything in the first person, which immediately tells you that the level of prophecy in the first 4 books of the Chumash and the level of prophecy in the last book of the Chumash are not the same. The one is Hashem speaking through Moshe. That's the highest level of prophecy you could have. And the other is Moshe speaking in his personal capacity, effectively reviewing everything that Hashem already told him, which can't be the same level of prophecy. So when the rabbis originally looked at the idea of how many times are you supposed to have the message of Amalek and remembering Amalek and eventually eradicating Amalek listed in the Torah, as far as they understood, it's going to depend on how many levels of prophetic insight do we have within the Tanakh, and each level of prophetic insight will give us one of the times we speak about Amalek. So the Parasha B'Shalach, which is the original story with the original ambush of Amalek, and then the pushback and the fight and Yoshua eventually beating Amalek, that is in the first 4 books of the Chumash. That is the highest level of prophecy that you could get. That's one seat, that's one location, that's one opportunity to speak about Amalek. Then you have Mishnah Torah, which is the name that we use for Devorim. Mishnah Torah means the repeating of the Torah, Ba Moshe. That's now a level down in terms of prophecy. So that's a different manifestation. That's a different delivery of the message about Amalek. That's number 2. Now we only have 1 left. Where's the next one going to be? In the books of the prophets, which is the next level of prophecy. In other words, the prophets are at a lower level of prophecy than even Moshe speaking in his personal capacity. But that's it. Now we've used up our 3 seats. So the rabbis say to Esther, we don't have room for another Megillah. We don't have room for another place within the body of work of the scriptures to be able to record anything about the story of Amalek, because all 3 levels of prophecy are catered for. And you're now bringing an even lower level of prophecy. Sorry, we've run out of slots. But Esther says something else to them. Esther says, Kisvuni ledoros. What I would like is for you to write my story as a Megillah, and that Megillah should be ledoros, should be for posterity. And as she says that, it shifts their thinking. Because now they realize, hang on a second. Yes, of course, we have a tradition that says there are only 3 possible times or places that you can share the story of Amalek in the scriptures. But maybe what distinguishes one place from the next is not the type of prophecy associated with it, but maybe what distinguishes one from the next is which book is it written in? Because now she's saying, write it as a book. And if that's the case, the Torah is 1 book. It might have 2 references in it, but it's still 1 book. And then the prophets are another book, still leaving us place for another book. Somewhere in the section called Kesuvim, there's room for another book. And they say, you know what, you make a good point. We're now going to authorize the writing of the Megillah of Esther and the inclusion of such a Megillah into the scriptures. Which is quite interesting, right? So now we see that there's something about the Megillah which is not just about the story that it tells and not just about the prophecy behind that story. There's something about the Megillah that has to do with the fact that it is written. That becomes the key over here. That's the linchpin over here, is the fact that it's written in a particular way. That's going to help us understand why the Rambam says that when Moshiach comes, all the other books of the prophets are effectively going to take a second row seat, But the Megillah, because it's something which is written, it's still in a class of its own. Now you're going to say, well, everything is written. It's called the written Torah. All of the books of the prophets are included in the written Torah. So what on earth do you mean when you say that this is written and that's not written? So let's go back to the verse that we keep revisiting, because this verse has all the information that we have about where you're supposed to record the story of Amalek. So what does it say? It says, Kesov Zois, write this down. So what does it mean, write this down? That means you should write it in the Torah. And it turns out now that it means that there are two occasions that it's written in the Torah, but it still is one category called write it in the Torah. Fine. Then it says zikaron. It should be a memory. When it says it should be a memory, that is referring to the book of the prophets, in the book of Shmuel, where you have the story of Agag, who was a king of Amalek, and that has to be recorded. Then when it comes to the Megillah, it says, Bas Sefer, in a book. In other words, the first and the third reference are specifically about the fact that you have to write it. Because the first one is, Kesov Zois, write this. The third one, the Megillah, is Bas Sefer, in a book. Obviously, if it's in a book, it must be written. But when it comes to the one that is recorded in the prophets, there is no reference to writing or to a book. It's just zikaron, a memory. So that will help us to explain how come it is that the story of Amalek has to be recorded in 3 different places, but one of those places might not still hold the same position when Moshiach comes. Which one? The book of the prophets. Why? Because the book of the prophets is for memory. Let's put that into different words. The story as it's recorded in the book of the prophets is a memory aid. Now, you know, what do they say when people get a little bit older, you know? They start to get aids. Hearing aids, walking aids. Memory aids. What's a memory aid? What is a memory? Can't remember, exactly. What's the purpose of a memory aid? It's a prompt. It's exactly what it is. It's a prompt. In other words, the memory aid doesn't have value in itself. It has value in the fact that it triggers the memory. So, you know, when a guy, like the Gemara actually talks about this, about the idea that you tie, people want to remember something, you should tie something around their finger, or it says actually in those days, they would tie knots, like I guess in their tunic or whatever they were wearing, they would tie a knot. And that would be a thing to remind you that you have to do something. So in the good old days, before we had smartphones, and people used to do that, they used to, you know, tie something around their finger, put the watch on the wrong hand, or whatever the case be. So then you'd say, I know I have to remember something, I just can't remember what I had to remember. Now, Baruch Hashem, we have smartphones, you can actually put in a reminder that tells you X, and then, you know, it reminds you exactly what you have to do. The problem is, by the time you take out the phone and open the app, you can't remember what it is that you're supposed to remind yourself.
The thing you can't remember are telephone numbers, because you used to store
That's
them in
right.
the brain.
Exactly. So what is a memory aid? The memory aid doesn't contain the information. The memory aid is only a trigger to remind you of the information. Okay? Whereas, if something is actually written in the book, then the book has the information. The book's not a trigger to remind you of something. The book has the information. So because the Torah uses the word memory when it's talking about the prophets, and it uses the words write for the Chumash and in a book for the Megillah, that tells me that the Megillah and the Chumash are in one category where the information is actually stored in the actual book itself. And prophecy is just a trigger for memory. What does that mean? So it means this. This is going to be really, really interesting. It means there are certain things that we do as Jewish people today because the prophets say we should do them. Most of what we do as Jewish people today is because of what the Chumash says. So for example, when it comes to Shabbos, why do we keep Shabbos? Because the Torah says 6 days you should work, on the 7th day you should rest. That's why we keep Shabbos. There's it clearly in the Torah, right? But there are certain aspects of Shabbos that we do because of what the prophets tell us. For example, the prophet Yeshaya says that the way that you speak on Shabbos should be different to how you speak during the week. That's why people don't talk about business on Shabbos, because that is in the prophets. What's the difference between an instruction that is in the prophets and an instruction that is in the Chumash? So remember, yesterday we learned that if a person hears a prophecy from the prophet and then they disobey it, that's a capital offense, right? But that's only if you heard it from the prophet. We, centuries later, if we read something that the prophets say and we don't actually follow it, it's definitely not a capital offense. And in a certain respect, it's not even as serious as transgressing something that's written in the Chumash. Why? Because the difference between the Chumash and the prophets is that the prophets record things that happened once upon a time. When we read those things, they remind us about how we should behave now. The Chumash is a living document that speaks to us now. In other words, when I read in the Chumash that 6 days shall you work, and the 7th day you shall rest, that is a current message that Hashem is telling me now, as if I was standing at Mount Sinai right now. And that's why we have an expression that we say, Kol Yom Yu Beinecha Kechadoshim, that every single day you should experience Judaism as if it's brand new, as if you right now were standing at Sinai and being personally instructed in this particular mitzvah. In other words, the difference between something that is written in a book, in the Torah's language, right? Kesovzos, write this in a book, or Bas Sefer, recorded in a book, versus something that is zikaron, that is just a memory aid, means that something which is just a memory aid eventually may no longer have relevance. If I don't have to be reminded anymore because I'm living in the time of Moshiach and everything is so clear and everything is so obvious, then I don't need the words of the prophet so much anymore because they were supposed to remind me. I don't need the reminder. But if something is written in the book, that means that it is current and it is dynamic and it is therefore not just eternal information, because all of Torah is eternal information that will never change. It's an eternal instruction. It's a current instruction. It is relevant in my life now as it was when I stood at the foot of Mount Sinai. This is what Esther says to the sages. She says, Kisvuni, write my story, write it as a book, Ledoros, forever. I don't want the Megillah just to be another book of the prophets to remind us of an event in Jewish history that we should learn a lesson from. I want you to write the Megillah exactly like the Chumash was written. Write it as a document that is going to be current and relevant and dynamic at every moment in history. And they agreed to that. And therefore the Rambam, and when the Rambam speaks, he's now speaking halachically, which means it's binding. The Rambam says all the books of the prophets, when Moshiach comes, will lose their power and relevance because we won't need the reminder. But the Megillah, he says, I didn't tell you this information before, the Megillah, he says, will remain like the 5 books of the Chumash. Meaning it will have that same force and that same currency as the Chumash itself. Which is quite a powerful thing, because suddenly now it totally recalibrates and redefines for us what the Megillah is. It turns out the Megillah is now as powerful as the Chumash, making it the next most powerful book that we have in the Tanakh, which is quite fascinating.